Thank you, Meg. I'm very pleased to present to you all our next panel, a Pledge for Change plenary event moderated by Sofia Sprechmann Cineiro? Sofia? Did I pronounce it okay? Cineiro, thank you, Secretary General at CARE International, a leading poverty-fighting and humanitarian response organization committed to social justice and gender equality. Sofia has worked for CARE since 1994, providing leadership and support to programs in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East and Latin America. In particular, she has extensive experience in gender impact studies, evidence-based policy, advocacy, partnership, and participation. Prior to her work in international development, Sofia worked as a sociologist in the field of public opinion polls and audience research in Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil. And hosting the panel today will be followed by a Q&A. Please, you're also going to be hosting the Q&A. That's right. Please give Sofia a warm welcome. Thank you.
May I briefly correct, I'm the former Secretary General of CARE International. I left CARE after 30 years with CARE in last October. And I'm very honored to be the chair of the Pledge for Change on Decolonizing Aid, which I co-founded with friends who hopefully can join right away here on the stage. And I'll introduce you all. So here on the stage with me, we have the Executive Director of Oxfam International, Amitabh, who is the co-chair of the Pledge for Change on Decolonizing Aid, together with myself. Thank you for being here. We have Patrick Watt, the Executive Director of Christian Aid. We have Danny Glenwright, the CEO of Save the Children Canada. And we have Halima Begum, the Director of Oxfam Great Britain. Maybe just I want to really honor here the other members of the Pledge for Change. Maybe you can raise your hand so that everyone sees you, of signatories, of supporters. As you can see, it's a crowd. It's a crowd, and I wish everyone was here on stage, and I hope you reach out to them over coffee break and throughout the session and have had a conversation. So as you can see, it's several of us. And in particular, I want to honor also Degan Ali, who is not in the room, because she really has inspired the pledge and has been a true voice for decolonizing our sector, and it's a shame she's not here with us today. She would definitely be on this panel today otherwise. Briefly, well, as I mentioned, I left CARE a few months ago after 30 years with CARE. But maybe just briefly, when I joined the sector, I was very much inspired, coming from the Latin American feminist movement, by a sentence which I'm sure will resonate with all of you, which is, nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us. That really also drove my inspiration for this line of work and also for the pledge. And as all of us who have been discussing this topic over the last day and a half know, the humanitarian sector has not been exactly true to this very important principle. All the contrary. We have seen lots of obstacles for this to come to life, lots of barriers for this to come to life, and we have talked about them extensively in all of the sessions. And we have also mentioned a word quite in an insistent way over the last days, which is the word localization, which I'm not actually a fan of, because it suggests that what the international community was doing and INGOs needs to be localized and just handed over in its same shape by local actors. Therefore, I'm much more a fan of locally led and globally supported, but locally led, which may look quite differently than localizing what was there. And I think we saw that in action this morning when Hibak, Salar, Ross, Awad, Safar, and Ahmed showed us truly locally led options of doing humanitarian response in quite different ways rather than localizing what INGOs may have been doing. So the question is, of course, and we have here a panel of INGOs, is there a role, and what should be the role for international NGOs in this context? And I do believe that there is a role if response is locally led and then globally connected and supported. There is a role, because I actually like citing, I can't remember who said it, but a quote which inspires also my work, which is, if the world would be a country, it would be the most unequal country of the world. If the world would be a country, it would be the most unequal country in the world, which means to me that not everything can also be locally resolved, because we well know that there's underlying causes of poverty and inequality that of Tanzania, of Uganda, of Syria, of Ecuador, of my country, of Uruguay, that do not reside in those contexts. But there's a lot of in-between inequality between countries. So there's also a role for global solidarity to touch the very wound of the inequality between countries, which is larger than the inequality within countries. So focusing exclusively on the local will not help us address the inequality between. And Oxfam does this brilliantly by showing the large inequality. Has this ceased to work? Can you still hear me? Yes. Oxfam does a brilliant job in that regard by pointing out the large inequality that exists in the world, where wealth is in few hands. That is it the 7 richest people or 8 own as much wealth as half of humanity? So there is a role for also international organization to address that inequality between. And the vectors, we are not talking about the vectors, you call them, Meg, the vectors maybe of evil, of the trade, the multinational, organized crime, climate change, all of that also exists that must be addressed. And there is still room for international solidarity between countries and between the people, between all of us. Just what is it that we want to address? So with that in mind, the pledge came to being to reimagine the role of international NGOs in this very context. What can it look like? And it made a pledge is a promise. It's a promise for change. And the pledge has 3 important areas to which 13 international NGOs committed to deep change around equitable partnerships with partners all over the globe, in the global north and south, everywhere, equitable partnerships. It committed to ethical storytelling, and you may have heard, you may have been yesterday and attended the panel, and thank you very much to the review committee. Maybe you can raise your hands so that everyone sees those organizations from the Global South leaders. Charles, you're raising your hand. Asier is not raising his. There you go. Mary Rose. Very importantly, who international NGOs gave their 10 most important comms pieces of the last year for Global South NGO leaders to evaluate the extent to which these pieces of communication have still a colonial flavor or not. So judged by Global South organization. And by the way, this is an area that, for example, the Grand Bargain does not contain, anything on on ethical storytelling. And the third area of the promise for change, so equitable partnerships, ethical storytelling. The third area is about influencing the wider ecosystem, of aid. So with that, I would like to hear from each of you, maybe 4 minutes each, and then come the tough questions. But first, from each of you, 4 minutes on what have been the changes that your organizations have been driving since signing on to the pledge. What have been the obstacles, the trade-offs, the rewards involved in driving this change? And may we start with you, Amitabh. Okay, let's with Halima first. Yes, the 4 minutes, each of you first. What has changed, and then we'll dig deeper on each of the pledges.
Okay, thank you. 4 minutes. When I was thinking about what to say to this plenary, I was thinking 4 minutes, that'll be okay. I will be just going and then my time's up. But it should be that way because actually this conversation isn't really one about INGOs to reflect on how much change we've been trying to lead. It's probably the one that I think, Meg, you talked about at the beginning, that very active process of listening, because from where I'm standing, I've been in Oxfam for a year now, but I've been in the sector for about 30 years, like many of you actually, and I've worked in government, I've worked in the private sector, I've now come back to the INGO sector, and my God, how little has changed. So part of me is really struggling. The personal is political. I'm a feminist to the core. The personal me is struggling in a role where I'm suited and booted up as an INGO leader, struggling to make sense of the fact that in the last 30 years, that change is so slow. And then I'm aware that there are others looking on, apparently this person called Halima, who actually sits here on a panel with Amitabh, and we're responsible for listening to a whole call for a change that is called the Pledge for Change. And we sit within a bureaucracy that feels very hard. We are trying our best, but the bureaucracy and the system is much larger than the individual. The individual is part of a culture, part of a systems and practice that has years and decades of preparation to make sure that the status quo is upheld. So that's my personal reflection on how hard it is. Oxfam has been trying to work really hard to try and commit to the Pledge for Change commitments that we have ahead of us. But it's really, really hard. And the bit that I wanted to talk to you about was around equitable partnerships. And I could say that we've been trying to, between ourselves in the Oxfam GB entity, we also have an international network that comprises Oxfam International. We also have colleagues from our Occupied Palestine Territory office here. You heard from Bushra yesterday. We're all trying to move towards equitable partnerships. But I guess I would probably flip it back again to say, if the question, Sofia, was what would it look like rather than what is Oxfam trying to do, I'd probably go to national civil society. So as an INGO, Oxfam's end goal is probably to see strong national civil society articulating demands and needs and assessments for themselves. And for our role, essentially, is to think about that global solidarity piece. Now, that sounds really simple. But what's stopping us? And actually what's stopping us is the bureaucracy of an international INGO architecture that looks like it needs a country office, a head office, an international office, a regional hub, and a platform. So much international structure that by the time you think about power that's locally grounded, they're drowned out, that voice. Not by intent, not by design, but the sheer weight of the structures. So I hope that in this role, as a network that's committed to pledging for change, we might reduce that bureaucracy. We might actually go back to the core of what we should be doing, which is strengthening civil society, allowing locally led organizations, women's rights organizations, feminist movements, people power, those networks to define what is needed. And what does that look like in an equitable partnership? So Oxfam has got a partnership called the Women's Rights Fund at the moment. It operates in 4 countries, not enough, and we commit about £600,000 of Oxfam GB's resources, and the other part is invested from high-net individual donors who really want to see radical transformational work. Now, that is not even 1% of our funding. It's flexible funding that goes to women's rights movements led by lived experience leaders in 4 countries. It's an amazing model. But the challenge we get back is, well, why is it so small? Why are you not using your unrestricted funding to actually scale up such a program? That's my personal challenge, because I've not been able to answer it. But if we could get maybe to 20% of that funding in northern countries to shift to transformational women's rights funds, I think that that level of change that I have not seen happen in the last 30 years could happen in 5 years, and that would be a fine thing.
Thank you so much, Halima. Dani, to you, maybe you can dig deeper around the second pledge, which is ethical storytelling and decolonizing communications of INGOs. Tell us the progress that you have been leading at Save the Children Canada and Save the Children more broadly.
Sure. I'm going to start with Save the Children more broadly, and I'm going to start with the good stuff. About 4 years ago, Save the Children embarked on a research project to look at how we tell stories. And it was called Seeing and Being Seen. And we wanted to learn about the impact of the stories we tell, both so we could understand how they were coming across, but also so we could uncover if actually we're propagating unconscious bias, stereotypes, and unhelpful narratives in our storytelling. We had some other goals as well, which is, like in everything in our work, we wanted to protect children and communities. We wanted to build better relationships with people everywhere that we work. And we wanted to just tell a better story overall. As far as we know, it's one of the largest projects that looked at content in our sector. I'm not big on superlatives, but that's the tag that Save the Children uses. But we did interview 400 children across 10 different countries. And we had roundtable discussions in 8 regions. We spoke to staff in every single one of our offices, and we conducted focus groups, including with our audiences. And while we found that we are doing a lot of things right in our storytelling, I'm sure it's no surprise to everybody here that we had plenty of areas for improvement. We know we can do more to challenge discrimination, to dispel stereotypes, and just to promote better understanding about our work. And I think while we started this work before we signed on to the Pledge for Change, it aligns really nicely with the Authentic Storytelling Pledge, and the two are very connected. I think for me, one of the most important takeaways from this that we've mainstreamed throughout our work is that only the person who's telling us the story is able to say what dignified means for them and what the right way to tell their story means for them. Not Save the Children and not our audiences. So following this, we did a major overhaul of our image guidelines, and we created new global content guidelines. And these are now the central document that are used by all staff, all freelancers, all of our partners across Save the Children. And having been involved throughout this in the global content review, but also in the Pledge for Change with some of you up here, I'm proud that we've created these updates that reflect a deeper understanding of our desire to tell more ethical stories and create more ethical content. And staff now at Save the Children at country office level are involved in all of our content creation. They have decision-making authority and sign-off authority. And wherever possible, we are using local freelancers to collect our content and take our photos. And I can say I've been with Save for 4 years now, and everywhere I've traveled, we only use local freelancers for this work. And that makes sense. These are people who are sensitive to the context, to the cultural awareness in the context, and they help us reduce the unconscious bias and saviorism that is at risk of coming across in these stories. I want to talk briefly about Save the Children Canada, because we've been leading this type of work at Save the Children Canada as well. Somebody mentioned on day one, we're in a country now that isn't on stolen land, but Canada is on stolen land. And so when we work with Indigenous communities in Canada, we have to approach that from a perspective of putting the principles first: cultural humility, reconciliation, and safety and collaboration. And we are approaching our storytelling in Canada from this same perspective. I think it was Charles who said yesterday, you know, we're not telling community stories, we're having the community tell their stories. An example of this is during the COVID pandemic, we got out of the way and we made sure that the Indigenous youth had video equipment and had video training so they could tell their own stories about their vaccine skepticism, about the reasons that they decided to get a vaccine, and they had free reign to tell whatever stories they wanted, and we shared these on social media. And it had a much bigger impact in those communities than if I'd got out there and said something, and it helped us realize our health outcomes. And I think at the global level at Save the Children, this is the approach we want to be taking in all our stories. We want to be shifting the power dynamics, shifting who tells the stories and how we tell the stories. So Marianne is holding up signs to me. I'll try to be quickly because I want to talk a little bit about what we're not doing well. When we surveyed partners last year, we found that we asked them, has Save the Children fairly represented and accredited you in our work in external communications? 49% said yes, great. 26% said you're doing okay, which means 25% said we're not doing okay, and that's not good enough. So what we learned that we have to do more of is slow down. This work takes time, and if we're going to tell stories with dignity, if we're going to put people at the center of the stories, it means we need to take time so that they can actually be a part of the process. We also have to move away from that desire that we have to get the right shot or get the right story. I'm a former journalist, so this is the hardest one for me. Because I think we all have examples of that amazing photo or that amazing story that helps move people. And we know the impact of those type of things. But in this case, if a community says, I'm not comfortable with that picture, I'm not comfortable with that story, we have to accept that. And through our National Reconciliation Program at Save the Children, I get lots of photos all the time and I say to my team, this is a terrible photo. Why are we running this photo? It's, it's somebody's back to us and they say they weren't comfortable with us sharing another photo. And I say, okay, fine. Let's get creative and tell the story differently. Let's use audio or illustration or some other way to tell the story. The other thing we learned is we need to put money into this. If we're going to realize these new content guidelines and be ethical, we need to make sure that we're training people to do that across the board. And lastly, in order to walk our talk, instead of being upset if a child pulls their consent after we've collected their story and done all of that work, yeah, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of energy, it's a bit frustrating. But we should be proud when they do that because it means we're doing our job right and we're protecting that child. And if they don't want their story told, we shouldn't be telling it. That's not our decision. So just to sum up, I think we've got more to do, but Save the Children has come a long way and has committed to this work. And I'm seeing that both at the global level and at my team at Save Canada. And I have to say, as a former journalist, I'm especially proud of the fact that we've committed to putting at the heart of stories the people who are most affected by the issues that we're trying to highlight. And to me, that's not only the right thing to do, but actually that's the secret sauce in the best storytelling. And so I encourage all of you to be doing more of that. And I think that that's our commitment through the pledge. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you. Patrick, help us understand what Christian Aid is doing on influencing the wider system of aid, from equitable partnerships, storytelling, influencing the wider system.
Sure, thanks, Sofia. Really good to be here. Maybe a little bit of context about Christian Aid, because in some ways we're not typical of the pledge signatories. We're a much smaller organization than many of the other signatories, so I'm a kind of a charity midwig sitting amongst charity bigwigs here on this panel. And we are a partner-based organization in our origins. So, we've always worked alongside partners. We've never been a primarily operational organization in the way that some of the other signatories are. But it's been really good to be part of this process and to be part of conversations with unusual suspects who we wouldn't necessarily be sitting around the table with normally, talking about locally led programs, locally led humanitarian and development work. There's a report, if you search online for Shifting Power in Aid, there's a report that we brought out last year that baselines our work in relation not only to the Pledge for Change, but also to the Grand Bargain and the Charter for Change commitments to which we're signed up. So if you want kind of details on what we've done, they're there. And we will be following up on that with regular reports in the coming years. But just to kind of pull out a few examples of some of the steps we've taken since joining the pledge. I mean, first of all, we've adopted a formal position of sharing all our indirect cost recovery 50-50 with partners. We've withdrawn from all direct implementation, which we did in 2022. So we no longer directly implement anywhere. We were doing it by exception in 4 countries. That was a decision that had financial implications for us, but we felt it was the right thing to do in terms of doubling down on our partnership principles. We've invested more in survivor and community-led response, really responding to the kind of mutual aid initiatives we heard about this morning. So putting our resource behind existing community-led initiatives, allowing communities, affected communities, to lead in the design and the implementation rather than coming in with pre-cooked ideas about projects. And we see the Start Fund, Irish Aid, as well as a number of other NGOs bringing in resources behind that. I think that's an exciting and important development. We've strengthened our partner accountability framework compass, so more feedback from partners on what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And we've strengthened, I think, our spaces for partner-led advocacy. So that's a little bit of how we've responded. I think, you know, some of these changes are complex because some of them require a shifting of the resource base in NGOs. And some, I think, actually are simpler. I don't think it's terribly technically complicated to decide that you're going to share ICR equally with partners. It's either a decision you take or you don't. So I think, you know, those kind of stroke of the pen changes, those signals about the direction you want to take, I think are open to every NGO, INGO that has signed up to the pledge. I think there are some quite fundamental mindset shifts that are needed in the sector. I think we have to be playing a smaller role, a humbler role, a more niche role where we're clear about where we're adding value and where it is that actually we're just adding a layer, and recognise that we're part of an ecosystem. I think there's a habit in INGOs, including partner-based INGOs, of behaving as if they are the hub and the partners are the spokes. And the reality is that actually all of our partners are working with lots of other people. So we need to get into much more of an ecosystem mindset where we're stepping out of the way where it's needed, where we're being much more choiceful about where and how we add our voice or our weight, financially or otherwise. And I think, you know, stepping up in terms of how we engage institutional funders, who in many cases are upstream, helping to shape the compliance burden that INGOs are then placing on national and local partners. So that's just a little bit about the approach we've taken.
Thank you, Patrick. Amitabh, I'm coming to you because if there's underlying causes of poverty and inequality that reside in the global north, and if there's INGOs that have offices in Washington and London and Berlin and Paris and Vienna and Canberra, call it, where they can also address the causes of poverty that reside there, it's not an accident, right, that there's poverty and inequality in the global south. And many of those causes sit outside of the global south, I would say, maybe even the majority, if I may say. How can international civil society also play a role to address inequality more broadly, globally, and in between countries? And you've been doing phenomenal work on that. Tell us about it.
Thank you, Sofia, and thank you particularly for the pledge signatories. And it was great, Sofia, that you asked for a show of hands. But, you know, before I come to your question, and I'll link my response to the question directly, but I just wanted to say that the pledge was a product of a particular moment where the INGOs were extremely concerned about their relevance and legitimacy. And I must also say that, you know, many of us were using a framing, and that's an interesting framing. That's say 4 years ago, we said that as INGOs, we have 3 options: die badly, die well, or transform. I don't know of many examples of when people choose die well That's not the modernist notion, but it was very clear that most of us picked the idea of transformation. And I see Pledge for Change as clearly an articulation of that desire to transform. But what I wanted to say is that probably at this moment, even that framing is now irrelevant. I think that's, I want to go back to what Meg was saying. And there was a very, very strong message there that we would need to probably relook at the challenges. I do think fundamentally the ground on which civil society is constructed, and whatever you call it, the aid sector, the development sector, the international development agencies, the ground on which we are standing has collapsed. And I think that's really the most important message. For these 2 days, we need to come back to that message. And that message is about a collapse of a normative worldview of the post-Second World War era, which was so well articulated in the, say, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But what we are essentially seeing, and let me also say that somebody sitting in Gaza, somebody sitting in Congo would probably find this as anyways nonsense. Because for them, they've never experienced this normative worldview. The moral compass was never functional. But the global order was working with a particular moral compass, a normative moral compass, which was very conveniently used whenever the powerful wanted. And that's fundamentally changed. How do we now reimagine the civil society sector is the fundamental question. And that's how we'll start addressing what you are saying, inequality and questions of poverty. My second point, as I've been, my job takes me to different conversations and thank you, that's very helpful. So the idea of polycrisis also needs to be challenged. I don't see this as a polycrisis. It's essentially one crisis of the complete victory of the neoliberal order, which is then getting manifested in multiple forms. So the crisis of inequality, the crisis of hunger, the wars that we are seeing, the climate crisis, they're all manifesting itself in different forms, but it is the fundamental crisis of the neoliberal economic order where we are saying there are no alternatives. So, to come back to your question, I would really say that the primary objective of conversations like these should be how do we zoom out, get out of our silos. I just feel very uncomfortable that this is a humanitarian group. Then I go to a conversation where it's a human rights movement, and there is a climate justice movement somewhere else. Then there are developmental groups. It is about reimagining civil society with horizontal solidarities. Let's completely, I think charity is a word that we need to anyways throw out of our dictionaries. It is about solidarities. It is about solidarity for justice, for building an equal society and reestablishing the normative worldview that we are talking of. So that's really critical. Do we do service delivery? I hope. I'll just end with this. I hope we get out of this mindset that we are service delivery agencies for large, whether it's a corporate or philanthropy or government. It should be really about holding the powerful accountable, whether it's the state or whether it's the corporate or wherever, or it's just patriarchy. How do we hold power to account is the fundamental question and construct our design with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Amitabh. So there is a place for solidarity, and there is, I guess it's a moment, an all hands on deck moment, because there is so much to address and to fight against. There's so much. So how do we create that movement of, do we have 10 minutes? Is that what you're saying? Before the Q&A, good. We are coming to that, and I will ask them, therefore, thank you for pointing that out. So I would like to briefly hear from each of you. We are at this 8-quake moment, tectonic shifts in the sector. What would you like to share? What is your main message to this audience here about what the role of an international NGO should be at this very moment of time that Amitabh was so well outlining right now. Polycrisis, or one crisis caused by the power holders of all types. What is it therefore? If you have one message for this audience, what is the role of an INGO in this context? Halima, let's start with you.
Lose the I in the INGO, because the only reason why an INGO exists is because of the deep inequalities in an international system that requires a foreign charity that is then known as an international NGO to come and work, whether it's advocacy or service delivery, in another independent foreign country. So lose the I. If you lose the I, what you end up with is national civil society. So less of a conversation about ourselves and what NGOs should do, whether it's advocacy, service delivery, etc., more about how we actually strengthen national civil society. I ultimately believe that people in their own countries can hold their own politicians to account, and where there's a shrinking of civil society, that's where international civil society really has a part to play. So what I'd really like to think about is, you know, if we were coming back here in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, size, shape, scale of INGOs has shrunk, but shrunk to the advantage of a strengthened national society, civil society, because what we're doing with our structures is taking life out of civil society organizations.
Thank you. Danny, over to Lou. Lose the I. What are you adding to that?
So what I'm going to say is not going to be a surprise to anybody here if they've been listening for the last 2 days. I think we're going to die well, or we're going to die badly if we don't think about ourselves and our own mindsets. We cannot dismantle racism and structural inequalities if we're not examining how we look at the world, if we're not looking at our own biases, our own power, our own privilege. And as somebody, Sofia, Patrick, Mariana, who's been involved from the beginning of the Pledge for Change, we spent 1.5 years having these conversations. And it was so wonderful and so rich. But actually, I think what happened is because we did that, we missed it. It should be a 4th pledge. And we discussed this on a review panel, because I think that the only way this work is going to happen is acknowledging that a lot of people in our organizations are not having this conversation, are not thinking about their mindsets, are probably not in this room, but they are not doing that learning and that unlearning and that relearning that is required right now. And this is something that is essential if we're going to transform the sector. And my meal colleagues, when we met with Charles and Sana and Lorraine, and thanks to all of you for the time and energy and generosity you brought to that review, we discussed this because it came up again and again and again as one of our challenges. And even my meal colleagues agreed, even though they had immense anxiety about how we measure this. So just a couple concrete things that we're doing at Save the Children Canada, because we've acknowledged this in our strategy. And instead of, we look at 4 pathways for impact. Traditionally, our one pathway for impact was programs. But now we include something called organize internally. And that's basically walking our talk. It's approaching our work with humility, which I think is a word that came up again and again and again over the past few days. And what does that mean? It means this is constant work. This is work we always have to be doing in our sector. And so we've hired a full-time permanent senior manager for anti-racism and inclusion. And it's her job to organize this work within Save the Children Canada, to be leading this learning, leading these conversations. It's not easy. Sometimes it's really challenging and really painful, but it's essential if we're going to change. And the other thing that those of you who are nodding off, I think take note now. I hope you steal this idea, because we brought in an HR consultant to look at our competencies, those areas of work that all staff are measured on. And they're typically things like leading, effective teams, integrity and trust, accountability, etc. And the consultant came in and she had all these options for us to choose from. And we said, something is missing here. So we actually came up with a competency. 5 minutes, Mariana. I'm just joking. And she said, so we came up with a competency called cultural humility. And we've adopted that, and that's a competency that all staff at Save the Children have to demonstrate that they have. And I'm just going to read a couple of the behavioral indicators that are required for us to have cultural humility, because I think they'll resonate with this room. All staff have to see diversity in people as an opportunity to learn and approach things differently. They have to continuously engage in self-reflection about personal biases, assumptions, and privileges, acknowledging their impact on interactions with others. They have to approach cultural learning as a lifelong journey, recognizing that no one can be fully competent in all cultural contexts. And they have to actively listen to others without judgment, demonstrating genuine empathy and understanding and validating the emotions and experiences of those they interact with. Why are we here? Why does Save the Children exist? To have impact for children. And the way we're going to do that better, and we're going to do that in a transforming sector, is to shift our own mindsets, all of us and all of our organizations, understand our biases, address them, and be constantly and continually learning and questioning. And I think that's a big takeaway for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. Patrick, over to you.
I mean, I think Amitabh said it very well. We are coming into a post-ODA world. I mean, there will still be some official aid, but fundamentally that aid architecture that originated at the end of the Second World War and evolved through independence in Africa and Asia, and then kind of mutated again with the end of the Cold War, I think that's come to an end. And certainly since the 1990s, the INGOs and the Western official donors have been in a symbiotic relationship, and I think that's over. And I think in many ways it's a good thing that it's over. And we heard from Matt Tinkler at the start of the day about the very powerful story of Eglantine Jebb and the founding of Save the Children. And it's a reminder, actually, that all of our organizations, all the organizations in this room, not just on this panel, were founded with very modest resources by people with a vision and a lot of commitment, who went out and convinced others and made connections and mobilized funds, voluntary funds from concerned fellow citizens. All of our organizations originated as kind of projects in active citizenship, and somewhere along the way that was lost. We've become bloated, we've become bureaucratic, we've become complacent, we've become over-engineered at a cost to the health of civil society. So I do think the future is voluntary funded organizations that are smaller, that are clear about their niche, and are complementing the work of national and local organizations. So playing a role where it's appropriate of a catalyst, a convener, a connector, but not actually doing stuff ourselves, but supporting others who are making change happen already in locations around the world where that change is needed.
Amitabh, to you. So solidarity, humility, equality, self-determination, those values. What is the role of an INGO in the future in order to promote those?
Yeah. Thank you, Sofia. Just completely agreeing with what Patrick is saying, but maybe just to add to it, we also need to interrogate that, did we create essentially post-colonial tools of continuing imperialism? I think that's a question we must keep asking. But to be very specific to the question that you're asking, I do have 5 or 6 specific thoughts, and I'll do it before Marianne raises the time reminder. So the first one is, I think, to go back, that NGOs are not about competition. They are about collaboration. At least INGOs are constantly competing. We need to move out of it. It is about collaborating, working together intentionally. The second, I think, which is really important, to bring in the idea of political economy in our analysis. It cannot be that we are just looking at the cost, human cost, without really understanding the systemic reasons for why we are going through that. The third, I think it's important, is to, I would say that we need to build new alliances. And I talked of still what is the traditional civil society, the human rights, climate justice, a room at this juncture to push back on what Trump is doing to the world is going to happen only through a rainbow coalition. You need trade unions, You need students' movement. You need those social movements, the spontaneous people's movement. We saw their power in Bangladesh, in Kenya. I think if you don't bring that together, it's unlikely that we move ahead. Two more quick thoughts. One, I think we also need to look at our own relationship with money. How do we look at money? Ultimately, we as entities raise money and start feeling not as even trustees, pretty much as owners of that money. We need to remind ourselves every day that this money is not ours. It's for the communities. And until we do that, I think that shift is not going to happen. And finally, I do believe civil society is about the good in humanity. It's about compassion, it's about love, it's about sisterhood. And that is what should be really guiding everything that we do, and not the risk registers which are maintained by our boards and our managements. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much to all four of you. Several participants have come up to me over coffee breaks and said they were ready for questions before this panel even started. So let's go over to the questions. So who would like to take questions first? Over here.
Hi, everyone. This is Petra. I don't know about others, but I'm a bit aggravated with what was discussed today. I think, honestly, first, thank you for your interventions, and I know you're representatives of INGOs, so it's a bit tough to answer my question, but I'm just going to answer it anyways. You mentioned transform. Transform into what? Losing the I. When? I guess I've heard that conversation over and over, what INGOs should do, what we should do. Oh, we'll hire a consultant. Oh, we'll do this and that. And what we've seen is that ever since the fall of USAID, all of INGOs went into self-preservation mode, having meetings with alternative donors and trying to see how can we survive. But I guess the question is, when are you willing to walk the talk, and how committed are you to localization? If it is the point where local actors need you to dissolve, are you willing to dissolve? Lose the INGO, lose your own positions for the sake of local communities.
Hi, thank you. Kasaga James with Teach for All, originally from Uganda. I have a question around interdependency. And I'm going to butcher the quote of the incredible civil rights leader who I had a chance to visit the memorial of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said something like, I'm cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. What affects one individual in one place affects the other indirectly or directly. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. What Mr. Trump may have done in the US on DI and whatever, and approaching to take away the rights of other people, you could see it happen probably in my own country, because there's no guardrails, as you may know. Or you will see probably Putin trying to do more because now there are no guardrails. So the question I have in trying to dismantle the INGO, not dismantle local versus global, what is the idea of interdependence to address the challenge of that interdependence, the interrelatedness of communities and states, knowing if the dictator is emboldened in the other side, even these other dictators will be emboldened? That's the question. How do you see the approach in the new era of this?
Thank you so much for all the presenters. Fatima Ahmed, representing women-led organization working in Sudan. I'm just trying to find the difference, because right now we are working with INGOs on the ground, and the way that the government of Sudan is dealing with INGO, it has to be local implementing partner. And this is one of the requirements. And we've been implementing partner for a couple of INGOs who are operating. They have office inside Sudan. So I'm a little bit confused about when you said local led. So I don't know what is the difference, because from this experience, it seems like there is this collaboration. There is this, the local NGOs are leading the work and they are implementing. And this is, I mean, I want just to have clear.
Yeah, I can maybe try the first question because I think it's the most provocative, but also I should say none of those are questions that this group doesn't ask each other all the time. You're looking at a group of people who have sat together for 4 years and had these conversations. And I think it's important to note that we all work, well, most of us work within complicated federations where we're often, one of few voices arguing for the type of change you're advocating for. So we get it and we agree. Two things to say. We went through this review on Friday last week, and I was amazed, because I'm not involved in all of it, at just how much we have done, how much change has happened since we signed the pledge. Yeah, it's slow going. Yeah, I'm impatient. Part of it is 75% of my budget is contracts I've signed with a government entity to do work for the next 4 years the same way we've always done it. So we are changing slowly because we're obliged to work in the old way of doing things, and we're trying to move to the new way of doing things. And we're in a transition period right now. And some of these big shocks in the system are going to push us forward quickly. But I think this group of people here is among those arguing in our organizations to find opportunities in this moment to expedite this. And I think we'd all like eventually to work ourselves out of a job. I mean, I won't speak for you, but as you just said, your organization has moved completely to locally led implementation. So there has been an immense amount of change. I know I'm impatient, we all are, but please keep asking those challenging questions, because those of us sitting here want to be talking about this and want to be doing as much as we can. I'm not going to take the other two.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question over there, or comment, is exactly right. That in removing the normative scaffolding that existed internationally, however inconsistently it was applied, however self-interestedly it was applied, I think it has emboldened other governments, other power holders around the world to follow suit. And I suspect we're going back in many ways to a world much more like the Cold War world, where aid is given very transactionally to your friends, where human rights are trampled on with your enemies, no questions asked. Aid is not really about poverty reduction in any way, shape, or form. It's about greasing the wheels of geopolitical and commercial interests. And I think the space for civil society is going to become more contested, more adversarial. I think civil society increasingly casts as subversives. And I think part of the job of international NGOs in that world is going to be to give support and amplification to the work of rights defenders around the world. I think that's going to be a hugely important and growing part of the work of an organization like mine. And, we are going to have to refight many of the battles that people thought had been won. And, this is what's been happening in recent years, I think, is a reminder that nothing is ever straightforwardly concluded, that every generation has to fight anew the fight for justice and equality. I think that's the space we're in right now.
Just responding to the first question, to completely acknowledge what you said and to say sorry, really a sincere sorry. I think Halima did say that as individuals we try, but we are up against a whole structure of bureaucracy. And in that, I really don't have any explanations to offer other than requesting everybody to hold us accountable with greater force, ask us tougher and tougher questions. I think yes, I feel very impatient with the pace of change. We have been very slow, and we are probably even doing harm to the larger developmental world the way we are structured at this moment. So completely acknowledging it, and it is a battle that we internally must fight. So just wanted to say sorry, and we'll strive harder and harder. Everybody here, everybody here.
Yeah, I was going to link that first question with the last one because, as you saw, when it was probably more than 4 minutes, but it was sitting here with a lot of discomfort, actually reading this room and understanding fully that we've been saying this for 30 years, probably even longer. And anyway, we're just not moving fast enough. But I do feel that the current collapse of the post-1945 international structure, however it was upheld, but not felt in places like Uganda, its collapse will mean basically we have to make a virtue out of a necessity. So whether we like it or not, whether we intend it or not, I give it 2 years. We're going to have to think around creative ways in which to sustain what is absolutely necessary, because we can't afford everything, right? And if we were to place a good bet on what we want to sustain, it's going to be national civil society organizations with locally led mechanisms for holding their governments to account. Now, that's why I think it's really important to actually enable civil society to challenge every dictatorial move that might be on the rise, because if we don't challenge that, then it just means other people would take inspiration. I was so pleased to hear, actually, my own government, it's very rare that you'll hear me say this, by the way, my own government in the UK call out the Rwandan aggression in Eastern Congo recently. Because up until recently, as Patrick was saying, that certain countries have their own allies, and depending on who their allies are, we will call out human rights violations. And we broke tradition, because Rwanda, for the British government, was a friend and an ally. However, it needed to be done. It was so sad being in Kinshasa last week for me, because, as you know, that conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo goes back 200 years, all about the minerals, right? Not actually about ethnic tension. We have ethnic tension in the UK. We have it in America. Nobody's saying, oh, that country's in chaos because of ethnic tensions. But really, that is a century-old battle around resources, and now it continues between Rwanda and the DRC. So fundamentally, if we didn't strengthen civil society, we can't challenge that. But the only way to strengthen civil society is to think about our finite resources, and do we have resources spent in our headquarters, or do we actually think, get out of the way, let's give it to civil society in Bangladesh or Uganda? That might just work. And I don't think we'll have a choice. I give it 2 years, but let's get ahead of that curve and not keep talking about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sofia, and all of our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. And now you are all welcome to make your way into the foyer for an afternoon pick-me-up. Please mind the clock. Make sure you reach your next session by 10 till 4, so you have a little under half an hour. We have 25 minutes till your next session. And then, once they end, please be back here no later than 5:20 for the closing of the second day of the Humanitarian Leadership Conference. So 5:20 to be back here for the closing. Thank you.